Chapter 32. Roland ran as fast as he could towards Felvar's manor. He caught a glimpse of the battle between the men and whites, seeing the writhing mass of creatures pushing up against the stolid line of mountain men, and had to fight the urge to join his friends in the battle. Part of him had hoped to get to participate in the smaller fight, hoped that Alice would help Felvar defeat her husband, but a secret part of him felt like he could somehow tilt the scales in favor of the god of thunder, somehow become a hero in his own right. He let the thoughts of becoming a hero fill his heart and give him ambition to drive him forward. He pushed and moved faster, skipping over the familiar path carved into the mountain. The narrow walls of the path slowly drowned out the sounds of the battle behind him, but at the same time he started hearing the very different sounds of a duel in front of him. Turning the final corner, the field before Felvar's manor opened in front of him. Instead of the lush expanse from before, the grounds were now pitted with small craters. Boulders fell against the sides of the field where they met the cliff faces around it. At the heart of it all were two battling gods. Felvar was swinging his hammer, over and over, shouting in a fury as he tried to drive his hits past Dis's sword. Each swing would push the god of darkness a little in the direction of its force. Something odd was happening, though. Whenever the hammer looked like it was going to meet the swords, a small flash of light seemed to illuminate a shell. The hammer always came to rest on this shell. Screaming in rage, Felvar reared back and launched his full strength into the next blow. The result was Dis being launched like a ball towards the nearest cliff face. On impact, dust and rock chips filled the air, but so did Dis's laughter. This is amusing. I had no idea my old sword could be so strong as a shield. The Demon King walked out of the cloud, completely unscathed. I'm glad you are angry. He kept walking forward, his steps measured, his breathing calm. I'm glad you are coming at me with your full strength. He stopped when he was nearly directly beneath Felvar. I'm ready to show you what can happen when you face an equal. He plunged Reaver into the ground and held his arms out to his side. I don't need a crutch to beat you. Dis's wings straightened out to his sides, then seemed to keep stretching. Roland couldn't understand what was happening. Dis's wings seemed to morph into long, black ribbon, each ribbon fully 30 feet long, then started to wrap themselves around Dis's arms. The darkened energy already coalesced around his hands grew darker. Their gloves stretched even further up his arm to the bicep. Remember, I was your apprentice before you betrayed me. He held up his hands, now with each finger tipped like a talon. Small arcs of electricity danced from finger to finger. I don't need Reaver to kill you. He kicked off from the ground and launched himself up to Felvar's level. The Thunder God was surprised, but had enough sense to bring up the hilt of his hammer to block the blow Dis threw at his face. The impact of the swipe shot Felvar to the ground faster than he had launched Dis at the cliff. Felvar stumbled from the hole left in the ground, dazed, but not seriously harmed. Before he could fully recover, Dis was on him. Dis, even fighting with his hands, aimed each swing and swiped carefully. Felvar was struggling. The hammer was built for offense, not defense, but he was managing to keep any of the claws from landing on flesh, for now. Roland realized Felvar was not holding ground against Dis, but he had a plan. Dis didn't seem to realize Roland had even come to the field, and as such had left his sword simply stuck in the ground. While Dis was focusing on pushing Felvar back towards the ledge on the far side of the field, each step put more and more distance between the fighting gods and the god-slaying weapon. Roland moved quickly, staying near the shadows as long as he could. He rounded the field and put himself as close to the sword as possible, then ran. When his hands wrapped around the hilt of the sword, he breathed a sigh of relief. The gods were still fully focused on one another, so he was able to arm himself with Reaver without interference. It took more effort than he would have been happy to admit pulling the sword from the ground, and its size belied its weight, but he felt confident he could find some opening to use it against Dis. He dropped his own sword into the notch Reaver left in the ground and started to run after the battling gods, hoping he could somehow help Felvar win. Cyrus pressed up against the whites forming the edge of the circle, trying to gain a moment to breathe between Disor's attacks. The monster had managed to land a few cuts, but so far none of them were serious. His luck, though, would eventually run out. Suddenly he felt a sharp pain coming from his shoulder. One of the whites had decided to take a bite out of him. Just as he looked towards the creature, a sword seemed to sprout from its head. None of you will interfere with our fight, Disor yelled. He grabbed Cyrus by the shoulder before the young man could even begin to wonder how the creature could move so fast. Cyrus felt a familiar tingle, the feeling of healing energy being pumped into him. All of his aches and pains vanished. All of the wounds he had sustained so far healed instantly. One of us is an Earth Scion. He nodded, then took a few steps back. Consider this gift our apology for the interference. We intend this to be a measure of you, not a pitiless brawl. Cyrus felt his hope of victory start to dwindle. He had known the creature was strong, but it had grabbed him and healed him faster than he could even process what was happening. "Please, Warden, stop holding yourself back." With those words, the creature lifted its sword in front of its face in the salute. Cyrus pressed down the dread rising inside him. He closed his eyes and slowed the time around him as much as he could and focused. In his inner desert, he found some peace. "If I must die today, I will die with strength," he told himself. He opened his eyes in the real world. Now they were cold and steady, like they had been when he had first emerged from his training. "Good. You're ready," Desor said, smiling. Cyrus didn't answer. Instead, he started directing his energy with precision. He accelerated his movement across the circle and caught the creature with a swipe to its side before it could move, tossing it to the ground. Cyrus didn't relent. He followed it, and just as its body landed, he hit it again with an overhead swing. He was rewarded with the sound of a loud crack, hoping that it had been its skull fracturing. He tried to catch it with another swing, but the creature started to go on the defensive and tried to sweep Cyrus's legs from underneath him, buying it some distance to stand up. They came at each other with renewed fury, exchanging blows, each swing shifting from defense to offense. Neither could gain ground on the other. Neither was willing to give ground to the other. Finally, Cyrus managed to gain another blow against the creature's shoulder. He heard another crack, but the creature did not go flying as it had before. "We are impressed," it said, jumping back to put some distance between the two. It stretched its broken arm out to its side. With a loud pop and the sounds of tearing meat and flesh, the creature's arm stretched out, then set itself back in place. The creature flexed the arm a few times, checking to make sure it was truly healed. "We should show you more respect than we have been," it said. One hand started undoing the buttons at the top of the robe. Once the robe parted from chest to hip, the creature let the robe fall backwards, revealing its entire upper torso. It raised its arms above its head, and with the sickening sound of ripping flesh, its wings shifted from its back to its sides. The flesh that bound the two appendages that made up each wing started to rip and separate. The tissue gathered on the appendage it was attached to. In a matter of moments, the wings had transformed into two new sets of arms. "We will show you what we can truly do." The creature felt around inside the remnants of its robe and pulled out another sword. The upper arms passed their sword down to the middle set. Now, 2 swords amongst 6 arms, Desor charged Cyrus again. Alice walked towards the line of soldiers, watching carefully for the telltale shadows near Lyra's presence. Since leaving the circle, she had felt its power wane, then resurge as it latched onto Sarah for its source. But she had no doubts the girl could hold on while she dealt with Lyra. To her right, a soldier clutched his ankle and fell, dead from the poisonous touch of death energies. She caught the line of shadows trailing away from the soldier and watched as it melted into the deeper shadows formed by the cliffside and setting sun. "Come out, Lyra. You don't know what sort of man you're serving." Alice heard her daughter's whispered reply, reverberating from the shadows all around her, hiding the girl's exact location. "I spent more than enough time with him to pass my own judgment. I didn't turn my back to him the instant he appeared." Alice let the mask of leadership slip a bit. She couldn't address her daughter like just another soldier. "I knew him better than I knew myself. The thing walking around with his face is not your father. It is a warped, twisted shadow of the man I knew." "How would you know?" Lyra's voice whispered back, spite and anger woven between each word. "Were you so upset with the way he murdered my would-be rapist? Are you so disappointed that he wants justice for the injustice done against all 3 of us?" "I'm angry," Alice's voice quivered, her eyes searching for any clue of Lyra's location. "What was done to us is wrong, but he and I know things you do not. He is trying to eliminate the gods and expose us to more danger than even he seems to understand. He has been corrupted by the very force he sought to protect the world from. Even at his worst, John would never have murdered the boy that attacked you so mercilessly." A small smile lifted the corner of Alice's mouth. "It would have killed him still, but much cleaner and quicker." The darkness in Lyra, much stronger now, started to whisper to her. What danger could possibly have justified binding him to a tree and sacrificing her, me, over and over again? Lyra's voice shouted back, every few words punctuated with the death of another soldier, her thoughts pushing her harder and harder. Alice realized she couldn't let this continue as it was. Her daughter or not, she had to stop Lyra before the girl did enough damage to break her own soul. She was having trouble tracking Lyra, so she decided to give herself some aid. She closed her eyes and focused. All around her, grass started to sprout from the rocky, muddy terrain that made up the field of battle. She let it grow until the first few lines of soldiers were standing on a lush green turf. "You know exactly what corruption I'm talking about, Lyra. It is the same corruption that is whispering in the back of your mind right now. There, She felt her daughter standing on a patch of grass behind her, much further away from the soldiers. She lashed out instantly, wrapping Lyra in roots. Lyra let out an angry shout. "Let me go! You have no right to stop me!" Alice turned to face her daughter. The girl's beautiful face was twisted by rage into a dark caricature of her former self. She had looked so peaceful asleep, Alice thought to herself. "You have no right to kill these men. They are merely following the orders of their master, protecting his domain from the invaders you brought with you. Protecting their home," Alice said. "I'm going to set you aside for now, but we will deal with this later. I cannot let your mind be broken the way John's has been. I cannot lose you both." "You have no choice," Lyra replied. Alice noticed the knife in Lyra's hand as the girl flipped it around and plunged it into the roots holding her. "That has taught me a few tricks for dealing with goddesses of life." The roots died almost instantly, and Lyra sprang forward, breaking her way free of their hold. She dashed into the circle where Sarah knelt, focusing on keeping the power flowing into the soldiers. "Lyra, don't! She has done nothing to you other than be here," Alice yelled. Lyra looked up at her mother and down at Sarah. "Kill her. She never tried to help you," she thought to herself. The thought confused her, though. Sarah had tried to help her on numerous occasions. Lyra had always pushed her off and ignored her. She must die. She is trying to stop you from succeeding. The confusion worked its way into Lyra's face. "That's right, Lyra," Alice said, slowly moving towards the circle. "Fight it. You know what I'm talking about now. That voice is not your own. Don't listen to the darkness your father has put inside you. It lies." "Lies!" Lyra thought to herself. She knew her father would never hurt her. "Don't lie about my father." She flipped the knife and used the handle to knock Sarah unconscious. She then grabbed Sarah and tossed her out of the circle before dancing out of it herself. The spell collapsed instantly, and the buffer that had been supporting Felvar's men fell away. Alice snapped roots back around Lyra before she could move away. "Enough!" She walked forward, standing mere inches away from her daughter. "I'll deal with you later." She looked down and made more roots come up and tighten around the girl's wrists and hands, firmly locking them in place. "I have to undo the harm you have done." Alice set to work restoring the shield. She would tend to Sarah momentarily. However, she wouldn't be joining Roland in this fight anytime soon now. Dis caught Felvar's hammer swing with his hands. "You're going to have to try harder than that, old man." He smiled and forced Felvar's hammer to the side, then swiped at the god's chest with his claws. Felvar dodged backwards, but Dis's claws clipped his shoulder. Felvar focused for a moment on making his shoulder heal. The wounds wouldn't close, though. He felt blood start to trickle down across his chest. He couldn't stop the look of surprise that crossed his face. "Like I said," Dis said, spreading his fingers and letting electricity dance from claw to claw. "I was your apprentice." Felvar wiped the look of surprise from his face and squared himself against Dis. He came at the dark god with renewed fervor, swinging his hammer overhead, trying to drive the mad god into the ground. "It doesn't matter. You cannot win," he roared at Dis. Roland had seen the exchange as he carefully approached the fighters. He knew Dis had the tools he needed to kill Felvar, but he had faith in the god of thunder. When he had managed to work his way within 10 yards of the two, he paused. He had to watch and choose his moment carefully, or he risked wasting what little bit of surprise he might have. Dis dodged out of the path of the hammer and started raining swipe after swipe down upon Felvar. In defiance of his size, Felvar was agile. He would sway to the side and let a swipe pass him completely, and when he couldn't dodge, he would simply deflect the hit with the hilt of his hammer. The two were locked in a dance. Attack, dodge, counterattack, press. Over and over, they came together, and over they broke apart. Other than the one hit Dis had scored against Felvar, neither had managed to harm the other since. Felvar suddenly jumped back. He had recognized the stalemate and decided to break it. He charged electricity, pulling as much friction from the air around him as he could, and pushed it into the head of his hammer. He brought the great war hammer up and slammed it into the ground. A great wave of shattered earth, spewing sparks and gouts of electricity, screamed towards Dis. It covered the ground between them in mere moments. Dis barely jumped out of its path, but caught a burst of electricity as it broke from the ground, turning his jump into a tumble and leaving him rolling across the ground. Roland, too, had to decide what to do. The wave kept going well past the spot Dis had been standing and was quickly approaching him. He watched and tuned in to the feeling of electricity surging around him. He could sense the power in the air, far more than he had ever been able to push out at once. But he didn't need to draw this energy in. Instead, he latched onto it and pushed. He succeeded in diverting the electricity, but the ground still rippled under his feet, tossing him to the ground. He breathed out a sigh of relief, simply happy he had managed to not be engulfed by the destructive force of an angry god. Dis had already pushed himself to his feet by the time Roland fully recovered his own bearings. Roland could see darkness dripping from the talons at the tips of Dis's fingers. Suddenly, Dis raked his claws across his own chest, but instead of blood, a black putrescence poured down the dark god's chest. He placed his hand over the wound, letting it get covered in the black ooze issuing from his body. He then swiped the air, but instead of drops, black tendrils burst forward, like his claws had ripped and corrupted the wind. The tears raced towards Felvar. Felvar barely brought his hammer down between himself and the torn winds before they burst against him. Nothing obvious happened, but Felvar dropped to his knees. Moments after he fell, what cloth was on him tore, and where the winds had hit his armor, great gouges appeared. Dis walked towards the elder god, arrogance in his step, a sense of victory painted across his face. You can fight all you like, but I am on equal footing with you now. You recruited me because you knew, even then, that whoever's side I was on would be the side that won. Dis stopped mere feet from the god. You know what is going to happen. Are you ready to roll over yet? Roland hurried to close the gap between them. He didn't know how Dis had hurt Felvar, but clearly the god needed some time to recover. He didn't care anymore if he lost the element of surprise. He didn't care if Dis turned his full focus on him. He just didn't want to see Dis kill Felvar. He saw Dis raise his hand, electricity building around every claw, wrapping it like ice coating a fence post in winter. Roland lunged, swiping the sword at Dis, hoping he wasn't too late or too far to make a difference. Dis sensed the blow coming and turned to block it with his hand. He assumed a soldier had joined them and come to the rescue of its master, but as soon as he saw the shape of the blade swinging towards him, he dropped his arm and dodged out of the way. It's rude to use a man's own sword against him, Dis said, recognizing the boy he had left pinned to the wall of his home. You shouldn't have left it sitting out like it was available to anyone who wanted it then, Roland replied. Dis smiled, a genuine smile. You should run. This is the last time you will get that warning from me. I like you, son, but I can't keep overlooking the fact that you are trying your best to get in my way, and for the first time, you're posing a bit of danger to me. Roland kept Dis squarely at the center of his sight. Instead of letting the dark god bait him into conversation, he stepped forward and swung at him. Dis jumped to the side, the smile fading from his face. Now, that's not nice. Roland swung again and again. He had no idea what he could do to stop Dis, but knew he could at least keep him from finishing Felvar. Felvar, help! I cannot beat him on my own. Now that really is foolish, Dis muttered. You really shouldn't trust him. He's not even that seriously hurt. Roland felt a rush of air beside him, and suddenly Felvar was standing behind Dis. I was hoping you hadn't noticed. He swung his hammer from the side, catching Dis's shoulder, sending the dark god flying. Dis twisted mid-flight, correcting himself and sliding to a standing stop. Well, who should I go after first? The muzzled bear or the bee with the deadly stinger? He looked back and forth from Felvar to Roland. You don't get to choose. Felvar dashed in and started to attack. Roland ran after the god. He was truly in the fight now. No more standing on the sidelines. No more waiting for openings. Win or lose, he had cast his lot. What are you fighting for? Desor asked Cyrus, his foot on the young man's chest, pinning him to the ground. What drives you? Cyrus put as much force into a sideways hit as he could and slammed his fist into Desor's knee. He felt 2 fingers snap, but the hit had the desired effect. Desor's weight shifted just enough for Cyrus to throw him off balance and roll out from underneath the beast's trap. His fingers were the least of his concern. So far, he had cuts across his back, chest, arms, and legs. He had taken a significant blow to the head, and he was certain that, in addition to his fingers, he had 2 broken ribs, a cracked skull, and a broken ankle. He was having to fight his vision to keep it from blurring, and just a month ago he would have already been unconscious. As it stood, he was in bad shape, but he wasn't nearly finished yet. He circled, Desor mirroring his movements, until he was able to safely kick his staff back into his hands. Once the familiar weapon was gripped firmly by his uninjured hand, he dashed towards Desor. He faked a hit from the right and caught Desor square in the jaw, knocking loose the bone and twisting Mathis's face into a nightmarish version of its former self. Desor staggered back, and Cyrus pressed his advantage, landing 3 hits in rapid succession. Suddenly, the creature's head stretched upwards. The flesh at the base of the neck tore, and the whole head rotated. It settled with the bald man's face forward, then reattached. Cyrus was so surprised he had to take a step back, losing the momentum he had been building. Bravo, you managed to disorient one of us. The creature's voice had changed. It was now much more eloquent, softer, almost reptilian in its silky, deceptive tones. You continue to beat our expectations, but you still haven't answered our question. Why do you fight? Cyrus centered himself, drawing his focus back to the battle. He dashed in again, but this time Desor was ready. Every swing was met with the flight of a sword, deflected, pushed away as easily as if his hits were simply a summer breeze. Cyrus pushed himself, funneling as much energy, both magical and physical, as he could into his attack. His swings increased in speed to the point of appearing as a blur to the nearby soldiers. His body vanished into the maelstrom surrounding his swings, but Desor was always there to meet him. "We grow tired of the fight," Desor said, yawning, pushing away attack after lightning-quick attack. Desor simply stepped to the side and punched Cyrus in the back of the head. Cyrus tumbled forward, falling to the ground. His world had gone black. For what felt like an eternity, he was certain the blow had robbed him of his sight permanently. But slowly, oh so slowly, his vision came back. He tried to stand, stumbled, and fell to his knees again. He wouldn't give up, though. He pressed his staff into the ground and used it as a crutch to climb to his feet. "Stop, child," that silky voice called to him. "The battle is done. We have taken your measure and found you impressive. There is no need to impress us further." Cyrus gritted his teeth, pulling his lips back in a snarl. "This isn't for you." He tried to charge, tried to show off a moment of gallantry. He wanted to look like the risen berserker, come back to the fight from the brink of death, but his body was far beyond such feats. After a few steps, he stumbled and had to thrust his staff into the ground again to keep from falling. He pressed forward, though. Step by step, he grew closer to his target, until finally he was within striking distance. He lifted his staff overhead, planning to bring it down squarely on Desor. "Such shameful behavior is beneath you." Desor stepped into the swing and easily hacked the staff in half. He grabbed Cyrus by the throat and lifted him off the ground. "We will have an answer to our question." Desor tossed Cyrus away, sending his body rolling across the dirt. Desor walked over, slowly, and kicked Cyrus on his back. "Let us talk." Desor stepped on Cyrus's left wrist, then kicked his elbow, breaking his left arm. He walked around Cyrus, then repeated the process with his right arm. Then he broke Cyrus's legs at the knee. "We can, and will, save you from the pain. But before we let you join us, we want the answer to our question." It took every ounce of willpower Cyrus had to remain conscious. The pain flowing through him was greater than any he had ever felt in his life. At that moment, he would have gladly accepted death. No other thoughts could push their way through his mind. The sword tisked, leaning down and gripping Cyrus's chin gently. "Look at us." He shook Cyrus's head. "We said, look at us. We can stop the pain." Cyrus's eyes locked on to Desor. "Good, good." He soothed, and his head shifted, placing the woman's face at the front. This time not only did its voice change, but its body shifted to be more feminine. Breast butted on its chest, its hips seemed to grow wider, but ever present was the large amount of muscle that marked the beast as a monstrous creature. Cyrus noticed green energy slowly falling down the thing's arms. He knew they had to be pulsing into his head. "There now, we have dulled the pain. We have allowed you to think a bit more clearly." Desor's voice was soft and gentle, deep but feminine. "Answer our question." Cyrus simply gave the first, most honest answer that came to mind. Why did he fight? Sarah. Roland's heart was racing. His chest was burning, his arms sore and tired, and his head throbbing. Dis's movements were so fast he barely had time to get out of the way of each swipe, and he was only targeted once out of every 3 attacks. Felvar was faring much better. Other than a few cuts Dis had landed, he seemed to still be going strong. He would let Dis push him back, step by step, then place a swing whenever Dis turned to swipe at Roland. Most of the time, Dis blocked Felvar's swings. However, a few had gone through. The black nexus on his arm seemed to absorb most of the shock, but each time Dis would be pushed away. Bruises covered the parts of his arms not clad with the black energy, but any cuts seemed to heal within moments. Roland had learned, entirely by accident, that the sword could absorb any attack Dis shot at him. Dis had turned once and tried to lash out with the same swipe that had flattened Felvar earlier. Not having enough time to get out of the way, Roland had done the only thing he could do: cower behind the flat of the blade and hope it deflected the worst of the attack. To his immense relief, the weapon had seemed to drink the energy shot at it. Dis hadn't tried another attack like that since, instead focusing on trying to get inside Roland's guard and claw him directly. Roland waited patiently for an opportunity, for some means of changing the flow of battle. He had decided that when he could, he would back off for a moment and hoped Felvar would be able to keep battling without someone to distract Dis. His nerves screamed, his hands felt like they wouldn't keep their grip much longer, and his legs begged for relief. But he held his ground. Finally, he saw an opening. Dis leapt up into the air, trying to strike Felvar from above, so Roland danced backwards. As soon as he felt he was far enough back to drop his guard a little, he hunched over and huffed, trying to regain his breath. He had never imagined battle would be this hard. You shouldn't take your eyes off the fight. His heart sank as he heard the voice of Dis whisper into his ear. Before he had time to process what was happening, he felt a sharp pain in his side and went flying through the air. His ribcage was on fire. Pain blossomed and wetness spread down his right side. He didn't need to check to know he was bleeding and that Dis had just landed a critical blow against him. His thoughts centered on the pain, but something inside of him was screaming to be listened to. There was something else wrong besides his wound, and it took him several minutes before he realized what it was. He had let go of the sword. The thought of being unarmed scared his mind back to working order, and he quickly forced himself back to his feet. Dis had launched him a full 10 yards from the battle, but he couldn't see the sword. He knew it couldn't have gone further than he had, so he started making his way back towards the fight. Between fatigue and pain, he could no longer keep track of Felvar and Dis's movements. All he saw were two blurs slamming into one another. Occasionally one would seem to force the other one back some way, but inevitably they would come back into balance. He realized now that the two gods were closely matched. He had to get back into the fight. He had to help. Even his pathetic strength could tilt the scales in Felvar's favor. Suddenly his foot caught on a rock, and he fell flat on his face. The peace and comfort, even on this terrain, almost made him give up and let him fall into sleep. But he pushed forward. He put his hands firmly on the ground and pushed himself up onto his knees. As he started to stand, he realized, through luck or fate, he had tripped over Reaver. He gathered the sword and kept moving. As he drew closer, he started to draw in power. The electricity seemed to liven his senses. His vision cleared some. The pain, though sharper, became more manageable, and most importantly, his thoughts became easier to process. Anger warmed his chest. He had been useless, less than useless. He had been a hindrance. He couldn't keep letting himself surrender. He had to fight. With a second wind, he charged into the fight. No longer content to play defender to Dis's attacks, he started to swing. Hard left, hard right, overhand. Dis dodged each, but for some reason didn't try and counter. When he noticed Dis preparing to move towards him, he simply swung the sword at the space between them. To his surprise, Dis jumped backwards. Then it dawned on him. Reaver, the god killer. The sword wounded gods, and Dis was fighting with his hands. Dis couldn't block Reaver's attacks. He could only dodge. With renewed hope, he started to press in towards Dis, forcing Dis back towards Felvar. Once Dis was within range of Felvar, Felvar started to attack as well. While Roland's swings were wild and random, Felvar's were well timed. It would clip Dis's shoulder and send him spinning, forcing him into a leap or a roll to dodge away from Reaver's edge. He would swing low when Roland swung high, forcing Dis to try and twist between hammer and blade. They were pushing Dis to his limit, but his limit was very high. He looked like an acrobat dancing between the two weapons. Yes, Felvar would land a glancing blow here and there, but never did Reaver bite into the god of death's flesh. Dis also seemed to be losing the weird, sardonic joy he showed in the fight. His face had suddenly lost any semblance of fun, and his eyes were staying focused on Roland. Roland could feel the gaze boring into him, measuring him, trying to decide how to handle this meddling human. Roland pushed his fears to the side and kept fighting. Eventually Dis would slip, and when he did, Roland knew he could wound the god. Roland just kept swinging, trying to be random, trying to keep Dis from being able to predict which way the blade would come from. Roland swung from right to left, low, trying to hit Dis's feet. Felvar matched his swing but came in high. To both of their surprise, Dis seemed to almost throw himself against Felvar's hammer. He hit it with a loud crack and went flying backwards. His body bounced off the ground. Once, twice, 3 times, then rolled to a halt. Dis didn't waste any time pushing himself to his feet. He turned his head and spat out a wad of blood and phlegm, then wiped his mouth with his arm. Roland was amazed to see cracks lining the dark wrappings around his forearms. Felvar's hammer must have hit Dis with its full force. When Dis darted towards Roland realized Dis had used their own attacks to let him break their offensive. Roland found himself blocking again, except unlike last time, Dis was focusing his full fury on Roland. He would turn and throw an attack on Felvar, but these seemed merely meant to deflect the god. You wanted my attention? Now you have it. Dis snarled at Roland. Roland was almost running backwards. He felt like his feet were just scraping the ground. He was being propelled by the force of Dis's blows as they struck the flat of Roland's blade. Roland tried to turn the sword's edge into Dis's attacks, but somehow Dis would always twist his hands in such a way that he curved around the edge and struck the flat instead. Back out of this. It has nothing to do with you, Dis commanded. His hand darted forward and grabbed Roland's forehead. He pulled Roland's face down into his waiting knee, bursting Roland's vision with stars and numbness. Anger burned into rage, and Roland was back on his feet. Dis had already started to attack Felvar again, Roland left behind and forgotten. You shouldn't take your eyes off the fight. Dis's words echoed through Roland's head. You should take your own advice. Your fight is right here, Roland thought. Roland charged forward, planning to thrust his sword straight into Dis's back. The gap between them closed, and Dis didn't so much as glance behind him. Roland felt his heart start to race. He knew he had done it. He had succeeded. He had managed to throw Dis's guard and find his opportunity. He pulled the sword in close, putting one foot forward, and with all his might he thrust the sword straight at Dis's spine, right in between his shoulder blades. At the last moment, Dis rolled around the weapon. Instead of simply dodging, though, he grabbed Roland's hands over the top of the hilt. Roland felt himself being forced forward, felt the muscles in his shoulders scream as they were forced to keep extending. Dis pushed forward, hard, yanking the young man with him. Dis stopped and let go of the blade, then carefully took a few steps back. For some reason the sword felt lighter, even though his arms were more stressed and battered now than at the beginning of the fight. Roland's eyes followed the blade from the hilt. His gaze crawled slowly up the sword until they reached the tip, or at least where the tip should have been. Instead of seeing the sword's tip, starting 6 inches before that deadly terminus, Roland's eyes fell upon Felvar's pierced chest. Chapter 33. Desor bent down, her body distorting unnaturally, letting her face move fully in front of Cyrus while keeping a foot firmly planted on his chest. We look forward to getting to know you. Her voice came out softly. She opened her mouth and kept opening it. Her jaw distended, revealing a pulsing mass of flesh where her tongue should have been. It was the same tube Cyrus had seen the creature plunge into Mathis's chest. The tongue started to extend out of Desor's mouth, the flesh quivering and pulsing as if excited by its impending contact. Cyrus couldn't keep his eyes off it. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He knew this was the end, but what sort of end would it be? The tongue paused, suddenly going completely still. The pulsing stopped. The movement stopped, and Cyrus looked up to Desor's eyes and noticed they were no longer watching him. Desor stood up straight and removed his foot from Cyrus's chest. The tongue receded back into Desor's mouth, and her jaw clenched shut. Well, it seems the battle is over, Desor said. We are being called. We will have to postpone our joining. Desor walked over to Cyrus's body and looked him over. Age well, our fine wine. Then the creature melted away, darkening to an oily blackness and vanishing. Relief washed over Cyrus, and shortly after he fell unconscious. Alice sat in the middle of her circle, pumping as much power as she could into the soldiers. She had Sarah gathered onto her lap, and when the battle lulled, she would push a bit of energy into her. The girl had drained herself trying to maintain the original glyph. Alice admired the perseverance she had shown and mulled over the coldness she herself had shown when she put the girl into that position. Whether she liked it or not, Sarah was now her disciple. At least the girl showed promise. Alice could work with someone with potential. The battle itself had reached a sort of deadlock. Neither side was really winning. The mountain men were killing far more of the whites than they killed the men. This, of course, was due in no small part to Alice's actions, pushing away the corruption of the soldiers' wounds and fortifying them with energy of the planet. She had hoped to stabilize the glyph to work on its own, but her daughter had seen to making that impossible. Though her interruption was brief, it took immense amounts of power to create. So when the first one failed, she had been left with no choice but to plant herself on the ground and build it back up. The second one, though, had to be put together much more slowly than the first. She could feel the powers of Dis and Felvar clashing. One was a beacon of light, shining brighter than any other being around, except for Alice herself. The other felt like a great void, pulling all other energies around it towards the oblivion at its center. She wanted to join the fight. The two were evenly matched, so she knew she could help Felvar subdue her husband. She hoped that maybe, with the help of the other gods, she could find a way to drive the madness from him. Her thoughts died away as the light that represented Felvar blinked out. She stood and, forgetting the glyph, rushed to find out what had happened. The men didn't need her protection anymore. If Felvar had died, Dis would soon come to finish them himself. Roland looked into Felvar's eyes, seeing the shock lining every feature of the god's face. I'm so sorry, Roland cried out. White lines of power started to flow down the sword from the tip. They flowed smoothly, their energy calm, crawling towards the hilt. Roland tried to release his grip on the weapon. He knew what was happening, but he didn't want the power. However, he couldn't let go. The grip seemed to be fused with his flesh, and his joints didn't want to respond to his will. No, 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 he cried out as the light started to swell, causing the entire hilt to glow. He looked pleadingly back to Felvar. The old god simply smiled at him. Then it seemed like a ghost of the god started to lift off Felvar's face. Dis's hand leapt into view, clutching Felvar's skull. None of that, now. I have enough problems because Gaia managed to pass on her false memories. Black lines crept from Dis's hand and pierced into Felvar's body. The lines grew all over the god, wrapping him like a cage. Satisfied his work was done, Dis stepped back to watch. Roland watched Dis, hate filling his eyes. Dis had used him like a weapon. Dis had made him do this to Felvar. Without warning, Roland felt like his entire body was being crushed. The light from the sword grew rapidly, becoming almost blinding in the blink of an eye. The brighter the light, the harder the pressure crushing down on him became. In one moment, it felt like every pore of his body was forced open, and something pressed its way inside him. The violence of the power, the sheer volume of it, left him unable to even scream. As quickly as it had started, it finished. Roland's hand slipped from the sword, and he dropped to his knees. He was still gasping for breath as Dis approached him. "Sleep and recover," Dis said before kicking Roland in the chest, then the head, sending the young man rolling a few feet, unconscious. "All hail the new Lord of Thunder," Dis whispered quietly, waving his hands mockingly. He crouched in front of the slouched form of Felvar, taking the old god's chin gently in his hand, and lifting his face. "I'm surprised you're still alive." He saw Felvar's lips move as blood started to dribble from his mouth. Dis moved closer to listen. "What is it? Begging for your life?" He moved even closer, putting his ear mere inches from Felvar's face. "John, if you're still in there, I'm sorry for what you have become." Dis's upper lip curled back in a snarl. Rage flashed across his face, and in one instant he grabbed Felvar's head and twisted it fully backward. "God's damn it," he growled. "I wanted to take my time with that." The rage started to subside, and he stepped back from his work. He had expected some sense of joy, but he felt like he wasn't finished. He felt incomplete still. "Disor, come," he commanded, and with little delay the demon stood before him. "Withdraw my forces and let them scatter and scour the countryside to the east. We're done here, but be prepared to recall them back when I need them." He watched the now feminine demon nod its head and then vanish again. He had no doubt Disor would carry out his instructions to the letter, but he suffered no illusions that he understood the creature. He eyed the still form of Roland and came to a conclusion. He had a new plan, one that he had only passingly mentioned to Alice in a moment of desperation. He grabbed the hilt of his old sword and plucked it from Felvar's chest, then started walking towards the boy. "I'm sorry, but you were too good of a tool to leave unused." He jumped to the side the instant he felt the roots start to grip his legs, slashing down at the ground to stop their advancement. "Can you not interfere?" Dis shouted. "No," Guy said, raising up from beside the young man. He hadn't noticed his wife crouching beside the boy's prone form, probably because of the moss and leaves that now made up her cloak. "You have already killed the gods that wronged you, that wronged us. What purpose will it serve to kill this untrained boy while he sleeps, no less?" she asked. "It serves a simple purpose. Then I won't have to fight him while he is awake and after he has had time to train. Why would I leave him alive simply to have to fight him later to take his strength?" Dis replied. "Why fight at all?" Alice said, putting herself directly in front of Dis. "Why keep going with this?" "Because now I want things back to the way they were. The only way I can do that is to take everything and remake everything," he said, stepping forward. "You can't do this." She put her hand on Dis's chest, running it up to his face. "Please, he's defenseless. At least give him a chance to learn to defend himself against you. Even before, you know I wouldn't do that," Dis said. His voice softened. "Just isn't a smart move, Alice." Dis wiped a tear from Alice's cheek, letting his hand linger on her face, cupping her cheek for just a moment. "I won't let you," Alice said, her voice firmed, her entire posture stiffened. "I stand a better chance against you than anyone else here right now. I won't let you kill in my name, to try and restore a life to me that we cannot have anymore. I won't sacrifice the world just to satisfy myself." Dis stepped back, more disappointment than anger filling his heart. He watched as Alice called a staff to her hands and wrapped herself in an armor of thorns. "You might as well attack. If you want to remake the world, you know you'll have to take my powers eventually as well," she said to him. "Why wait until later? Why let me make preparations when you can just fight me now and end it?" "Never you," he said. "I won't take from you." "Then how can you win?" she asked him. "Because eventually you'll come to my side," he said. "Eventually, you'll give me your powers willingly." Dis seemed torn. He knew what his new plan would entail, combining the powers of all the gods into one person. He knew he would have to harvest from every other god, including his wife. He hoped what he said was true, but he had to prepare himself for the possibility of taking her powers by force. Fine, he conceded. I'll let the boy live today. It is a mistake, and one that might come back to haunt me. But he'd need at least a decade to become my equal. He'll be lucky to get a year. Dis turned his back on Alice and walked towards the center of the circle. Lyra, come on. Alice watched, surprised, as Lyra walked from a nearby shadow and skipped over to her father's side. He placed his arm around her shoulders, hugging her close to him, then sprouted his wings and flew away. Epilogue. Roland woke to a throbbing headache. He looked around and realized he was on a makeshift cot in the middle of a field outside Felvar's manor. There were other cots around. Each held another wounded soldier, but his seemed like it had been set apart. He noticed Cyrus on a cot, unconscious but clearly breathing, as well as Sarah. He let out a breath of relief to see his friends still alive. He noticed that across the field many of the soldiers seemed to be gathered around something. He stood up and realized that he felt no other pains but the headache. He couldn't remember the details of the battle very clearly. He still felt like he was lifting himself out of sleep. He walked across the field, taking his time so he didn't startle anyone at the back of the crowd. As he grew closer, he started to hear the telltale signs of mourning. A sniffle here, a quiet moan there, someone's shoulders shaking as they quietly cried into their hands. As he reached the back of the crowd, the people started to notice him. The men at the back stepped aside, poking their friends in front of them and pointing. He didn't understand why, but the crowd was parting to let him through. Once the passage was clear, he realized what was going on. Directly in front of him lay Felvar. His body had been put beside the body of Gaia, both being prepared for burial. The last few moments of the battle came back to him, and his stomach dropped in dread. Alice had been knelt in front of the bodies. She looked back and stood, raising her hands out, she called. All hail the god of thunder! All hail the god of thunder! The hundreds of voices chorused after her. Dis stood in the middle of the woods, receiving the after-battle reports of Desor in the shade. Everything had gone as well as he could possibly have wanted. He now had hundreds of his own soldiers in the living world, and his powers were fully restored. His wife was alive, even if she was currently against him. His daughter was alive, and by his side. He would get what he wanted, one way or another. He still had one question, though. Desor stepped aside for a moment. He approached the shade, Shodden, the demon responsible for organizing the flow of demons from the underworld to the real. The only other being he had given full permission to travel between the two realms at his own discretion. How did that boy that I killed, or at least thought I had killed, gain some of Lear's powers? He asked the shade. But more than that, how did he also come to possess a tiny trace of my own powers? I don't know, my lord. This is the first that I have heard he had, Shodden responded. He had the smallest amount of darkness in him, not enough for him to have really noticed, almost as if it were just a stain on Lear's. But one thing he said really caught my attention, Dis said, pacing around the shade. He mentioned to Lyra that a ghost gave him the gifts and told him where to go. He was a human, my lord. The shade said, They say silly things when they don't understand what has happened. True. Dis stopped and grabbed the shade, ripping it from the ground and holding it in the air. But you also asked after Lyra when I saw you at the watch post. You had never asked after her. So I decided that you had worked with Lyra, for whatever reason, to send an assassin after my daughter. The shade knew it had been caught. It muttered around Dis's tightened grip. She had to die. You were growing weak and soft because of her. The god of death must be cold and resolute. Look at you now. Look at what you did after you thought she might have been killed. That hate and vengeance, that is what your position represents. Dis cocked his head to the side, looking deeply at the shade. You have a point. Thank you for showing me the path back to being focused. The lines of black along Dis's body leapt forward and lashed onto the shade. The shade screamed as the lines tore it apart and pulled its pieces inside Dis. However, she is still my daughter, and you still sought to undermine me. Dis turned and walked over to Desor. You are now my voice. You rule the underworld in my absence, but you are also my general. You may appoint others to do as you need them to do. Run it as you please, but when I give the command, you come running to me. Desor bowed her head. Yes, my lord. Now let's go visit an actual friend, Dis said, walking into the woods. Lyra a step behind him. End of Book 1.